A late-night phone call, a terrified mother, a car pulling away into the Florida darkness, and never coming back. This is the haunting mystery of Crystal Brown and her 4-year-old son, Karam. It was just after midnight in Port St. Lucie, Florida, when the phone rang. The sound was sharp, cutting through the stillness of a quiet home. Crystal Brown picked it up, and in that instant, something changed. Her mother, standing in the doorway, would later remember the look on her daughter's face, her eyes widening, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. The fear was unmistakable. Whoever was on the other end of that call had filled her with panic. "Are you okay?" her mother asked. Crystal only nodded quickly, as if agreeing with herself more than with anyone else. She hung up without explanation and started moving frantically around the living room. She grabbed her striped sleeveless shirt, slipped on her jeans, and called out softly to her 4-year-old son, Karam. The boy, still half asleep, rubbed his eyes but obeyed, holding on to his mother's hand with sleepy trust. Outside, the night was humid, the air thick with Florida's late September heat. A silver 2003 Toyota Camry sat parked by the curb, its metallic frame glinting faintly under the yellow glow of the street lamp. At 12:30 a.m., the car door shut, the engine rumbled to life, and the vehicle rolled down the street. The sound of tires faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Crystal's mother stood at the doorway long after the taillights disappeared. Something inside her knew this wasn't just another late-night errand. The unease pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. It would be the last time she ever saw her daughter and grandson. From neighbors' windows, the scene looked ordinary, a young woman taking her child somewhere in the middle of the night. But to those who knew Crystal, the hurried way she left, the silence she left behind, and the distressed look on her face were anything but ordinary. They were the beginnings of a mystery that, years later, still haunts the streets of Port St. Lucie. The Camry never came back. The phone never rang again. And from that night on, Crystal Brown and her son Karam vanished, leaving only questions, whispers, and the shadow of a phone call no one has ever explained. Before she became a name on a missing persons flyer, Crystal Brown was someone whose life told a story of strength, resilience, and compassion. Standing nearly 5'9", she carried herself with quiet dignity, her slender frame often hidden beneath professional clothes that reflected her work as a social worker. Friends and colleagues described her as soft-spoken yet firm, the kind of person who could walk into a room filled with chaos and bring calm simply by listening. Crystal was born on October 6, 1978. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already proven herself as someone who wanted more than just personal success. She chose Hofstra University in New York, far from her Florida roots, chasing not only a degree but also a sense of purpose. Those who knew her back then remembered her drive, how she stayed late in libraries, how she pushed herself through challenges, and how she never forgot to call home to check in with her family. Her career path as a social worker was no accident. Crystal believed in helping people who had lost their way. Children, families in crisis, people struggling through circumstances they couldn't control. She was a bridge, a steady hand in storms that weren't her own. And perhaps it was that very instinct, the need to protect, to shield, that defined her even more as a mother. To those around her, Crystal wasn't just a professional. She was a daughter, a sister, and above all, the devoted mother of a little boy named Karam. Family gatherings often centered on the boy's laughter, and Crystal's pride was written on her face each time he called out, "Mommy." Even when she was tired from work, she found energy for him. Even when her marriage was falling apart, she kept her focus on giving Karam a life filled with stability. But behind her strong exterior, cracks had begun to show. Friends noticed she had grown quieter in the months leading up to September 2017. Living with her mother again wasn't part of her plan. It was a retreat, a pause in a life she thought she had under control. Marital troubles weighed on her, though she rarely spoke of the details. Instead, she smiled politely, worked diligently, and carried the burdens silently. Crystal's mother would later say that, even in her most difficult moments, her daughter never abandoned her responsibilities. That's why the night she left after that phone call felt so wrong. This wasn't the Crystal they knew. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't the type of person to vanish. Her disappearance wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about the sudden silencing of a life that had been full of purpose. A woman who had built her identity on helping others suddenly became the one who needed saving. And for those left behind, her mother, her friends, and most of all her little boy, the absence of her presence was unbearable. Crystal Brown was more than the face on a poster. She was a life interrupted, and that makes the mystery of her disappearance all the more haunting. If there was one part of Crystal Brown's life that defined her completely, it was her role as a mother. The arrival of her son, Karam, changed everything. For friends and family, it was impossible to separate the image of Crystal from the small boy who was always at her side. Karam was only 4 years old when he disappeared, a child with big eyes that seemed to hold endless curiosity about the world. He had a smile that could light up an entire room, and Crystal often joked that he was her little shadow. Where she went, he followed, whether to the grocery store, to church, or to quiet evenings at home. Their bond was not just strong, it was unshakable. Crystal had been navigating marital troubles in the years leading up to her disappearance, but she shielded her son from the storm as best she could. When she moved back into her mother's house, she told friends it wasn't just for herself. It was to give Karam stability, to surround him with the comfort of family while she figured out the next steps. "He deserves better," she once confided to a coworker, her voice heavy but determined. Her mother often spoke of the little routines that defined their days. Crystal would tuck Karam into bed with a kiss on the forehead, whispering prayers as his eyes fluttered shut. In the mornings, even if she was exhausted, she'd find the energy to make his favorite breakfast, cereal with just the right amount of milk, the way he liked it. These weren't grand gestures, but they were the rhythms of a mother's love. People who knew Crystal said she never made decisions without thinking of her son first. That's why the circumstances of their disappearance raised so many questions. Why would a devoted mother suddenly leave in the middle of the night, without explanation, taking only her child? Why would she abandon her phone, her belongings, her family? It didn't fit the portrait of who she was, unless whatever drove her out that night wasn't her choice. For investigators and for the family, the fact that Karam vanished with her added another layer of urgency. A child's life was at stake, a child who had no control over the decisions made that night. And for Crystal's mother, the pain doubled. She had not only lost her daughter, but also her grandson, the little boy whose laughter once echoed through her home. Years later, when the family speaks of Karam, there is a silence that follows. He would be a teenager now, growing into the years where he would have needed his mother's guidance the most. Instead, his image is frozen in time, remembered in photographs. A small boy with a shy grin, holding tightly to the hand of the woman who loved him most. The bond between Crystal and Karam wasn't just the relationship of mother and child. It was a symbol of safety, of trust, of devotion. And it's that very bond that makes their disappearance so haunting. Because when they vanished together, the world lost not one, but two stories, intertwined, inseparable, and unfinished. By the summer of 2017, Crystal Brown found herself at a crossroads. On the surface, she was still the same dedicated social worker, the same devoted mother who poured her heart into raising her son. But behind closed doors, life was unraveling in ways she could no longer ignore. Her marriage, once a hopeful promise of stability, had slipped into conflict and distance. Those who knew her say she fought hard to keep it together, to shield Karam from the tension. But eventually, Crystal made a decision that many women face when the weight becomes too heavy. She packed up her belongings, took her son by the hand, and went back to the one place where she felt safe, her mother's home in Port St. Lucie. The move was meant to be temporary, a pause button in a life spinning too quickly out of control. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a setback, but to Crystal, it was a chance to regroup, to plan her next steps. Living with her mother meant extra hands to help with Karam, a support system she desperately needed. It meant evenings where her boy could play in the living room while his grandmother cooked dinner. It meant laughter returning to the walls of a home that had always welcomed her back. Yet beneath the comfort, there was strain. Friends noticed that Crystal seemed quieter than usual. She smiled when people asked how she was doing, but her eyes told another story. She avoided sharing details about her marriage, brushing off questions with vague responses. Some evenings, she'd sit at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring into a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her mother worried, but she also understood. She had seen her daughter navigate challenges before. Crystal was strong, intelligent, and resourceful. Surely, she thought, this was just another chapter she would rise above. After all, Crystal had always been the one to help others out of dark places. Surely she could find her own way through this one. Still, something about her daughter's restlessness lingered. At times, Crystal would check her phone more often than usual, as if expecting a call or message that never came. She seemed distracted, carrying a weight that no one else could name. And when she did speak of the future, her words were filled with uncertainty. Would she rebuild her marriage? Would she start over completely? The answers never came. Looking back, the decision to move home may have been more than just a search for comfort. It may have been a warning sign. Crystal was seeking safety, a place to breathe, but also perhaps protection from something she never fully explained. That September, as the days grew shorter and Florida's humid nights pressed in, her mother clung to the hope that this was only a season, that her daughter and grandson would find their rhythm again, that life would return to normal. But fate had other plans, and the house that once promised safety would soon become the starting point of a mystery that has haunted the family ever since. The house was quiet that night. Crystal's mother had already gone to bed, the hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence of a late September evening in Port St. Lucie. Karam was asleep in the next room, his small body curled beneath his blanket, clutching a stuffed toy he refused to part with. For a few hours, life seemed almost normal, peaceful even. Then the phone rang. It was just after midnight, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. Crystal answered quickly, almost as if she had been waiting for it. What was said on the other end remains a mystery, but her mother would never forget the expression that crossed her daughter's face. The shift was immediate. Her shoulders tensed. Her eyes grew wide. Fear crept into her features like a shadow swallowing the light. "Who was it?" her mother asked from the doorway, startled by how suddenly the calm had shattered. Crystal shook her head. "Nothing. Don't worry." But her voice was too quick. Her words clipped, betraying the panic she tried to hide. She moved with a sudden urgency, pacing, grabbing her purse, whispering Karam's name as she headed to his room. Her mother's instincts told her something was wrong. She pressed again. "Crystal, talk to me. What's happening?" But her daughter avoided her eyes, focusing instead on waking her little boy. Karam rubbed his eyes sleepily, confused but obedient. Crystal slipped jeans over his small pajamas, muttering reassurances he couldn't quite understand. "It's okay, baby. We just have to go for a little drive." The atmosphere in the house shifted from stillness to suffocating tension. Every sound seemed louder: the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of clothes, the slam of a drawer. Her mother's heart pounded as she watched Crystal move like someone under pressure, someone answering to a demand unseen. "What about tomorrow? You have work in the morning." Her mother tried one last time, hoping reason might ground her daughter. Crystal paused just for a second, her hand tightening on her son's shoulder. Then she forced a smile that fooled no one. "I'll explain later." But later never came. By 12:30 a.m., the front door clicked shut. The silver Toyota Camry roared to life, headlights casting long beams across the quiet street. The car rolled away, shrinking into the distance until the taillights disappeared completely. Her mother stood at the window, staring into the darkness long after the car was gone. She replayed the look in her daughter's eyes, the way her voice trembled despite her calm words. It wasn't just distress, it was fear, as if someone had cornered her and she had no choice but to obey. That call, brief, urgent, and unexplained, became the fracture point of the entire story. From that moment forward, nothing in Crystal's life or Karam's would ever be the same. And for those left behind, the question would echo endlessly. Who was on the other end of the line? And what did they say to make a mother vanish into the night with her son? The front door closed with a soft but final click. Crystal's mother stood frozen in the quiet living room, listening as footsteps moved quickly across the walkway. Moments later, the sound of a car door opening, then closing, echoed through the night air. A child's faint yawn, followed by the low murmur of his mother's voice, drifted in through the open window. Then came the ignition, The silver 2003 Toyota Camry rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the still darkness of the suburban street. For a moment, Crystal sat behind the wheel, her silhouette faintly visible through the curtains. She glanced back toward the house, not in farewell, but as though checking to see if anyone was watching. Inside, her mother clutched the frame of the window, torn between calling out and staying silent. The unease in her chest was heavy, a feeling she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Something about the way her daughter moved, the hurriedness, the stiffness in her shoulders, made her stomach turn. But the words to stop her never came. The Camry rolled away slowly at first, then picked up speed as it reached the corner. The red glow of taillights flickered against the pavement before disappearing entirely into the night. The street fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something irreversible. Her mother lingered by the window long after the car was gone. The neighborhood was still, almost eerily so. Street lamps buzzed softly, casting yellow pools of light onto empty driveways. A dog barked in the distance, then quieted. For most people on that street, it was just another Friday night sliding into Saturday morning. But for one family, it was the beginning of an endless nightmare. Crystal's bedroom upstairs remained untouched, her purse and belongings left behind. Her phone, silent and later discovered switched off, was abandoned. On the kitchen counter, a mug of tea she had poured earlier still sat half full, a thin film forming across its surface. Everything about her departure screamed suddenness, urgency. She had left as if answering to something outside her control. Karam, barely awake, hadn't asked questions. To him, it was simply another nighttime drive with his mother. He trusted her implicitly, small hand tucked into hers as she buckled him into the back seat. But trust alone couldn't protect them from what awaited beyond the quiet safety of his grandmother's home. For investigators who would later reconstruct this timeline, this was the moment that mattered most. A woman in distress, a child in her care, and a car carrying them into the unknown. No one knew where she was headed or why she had left so abruptly. Her mother remained by the window until the chill of early morning seeped through the glass. She whispered to herself that they would be back soon, that perhaps it was just a late-night errand, maybe a drive to clear her daughter's head. But deep down, she knew. That was the last time she would see them. The night swallowed Crystal and Karam whole, and the silence that followed was the beginning of a mystery that would grow heavier with every passing day. The first night, her mother waited. She stayed awake on the couch, listening for the sound of the Camry pulling back into the driveway. Each car that passed down the street made her sit up, only to sink again in disappointment when the headlights kept going. She told herself it was nothing, that Crystal was simply visiting a friend, or maybe just driving around to clear her head. But as dawn broke and the sun spilled through the curtains, the car never came. By the next day, worry grew heavier. Her mother called Crystal's phone again and again. Each time, the line went straight to voicemail. No ring, no sign of life. The silence was deafening. Family members tried reaching out. Friends were contacted, but no one had seen or heard from her. It was as if Crystal and her little boy had vanished into thin air. The third day was unbearable. Every hour stretched like an eternity. The house, once filled with Karam's laughter and Crystal's voice, felt hollow. His toys still lay scattered in the living room, waiting for a child who wasn't coming back. Crystal's shoes remained by the door. The bed where she usually tucked her son in at night was still perfectly made. It was absence made visible. Everything was in its place, except for the two people who mattered most. By then, panic consumed her mother. The unease from that midnight phone call had grown into dread she could no longer ignore. On the third day, she picked up the phone, her hands trembling, and called the police. "My daughter is missing," she told them, "and my grandson, too." Investigators responded, but even their initial steps carried a weight of frustration. The last confirmed sighting was simply Crystal leaving her mother's home. Beyond that, the trail went cold. The Camry had not been seen. No traffic cameras caught her route. No purchases were made on her accounts. Her phone remained off, as if deliberately silenced. The days that followed blurred together in anguish. Her mother sat by the window at night, staring at the empty street where her daughter's car had last disappeared. Friends and neighbors came by to check in, their faces etched with sympathy, But no one could offer answers. The silence became unbearable, the kind of silence that screams louder than any noise. For a woman like Crystal, responsible, grounded, devoted to her son, the disappearance made no sense. If she had simply needed space, she would have called. If she had wanted distance, she would have explained. To leave her phone behind, to cut off contact entirely, that wasn't her. Something was wrong, very wrong. And in that realization, fear hardened into conviction. This wasn't just a delay. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something had happened to Crystal and her little boy. Something dark enough to erase them from the world without a trace. Her mother prayed she was wrong, but deep down, she already knew. The silence spoke louder than words. When the police finally entered the case, the first task was to reconstruct Crystal Brown's last known movements. But the timeline was frustratingly short. At 12:30 a.m., she drove away with her son in her silver Toyota Camry. Beyond that moment, the trail vanished. There were no bank withdrawals, no cell phone pings, no clear sightings of the car. It was as though she and Karam had driven into a void. Detectives interviewed family and friends, searching for leads. They learned about her recent marital struggles, the decision to leave Parkland and return to her mother's home, and the cryptic late-night phone call that preceded her disappearance. To them, these details painted a picture of a woman under pressure, someone possibly running from something or someone. But the official stance soon complicated matters. On November 28, 2017, just over 2 months after she vanished, a felony warrant was issued for Crystal Brown. The charge, interference with custody. Authorities alleged that she had taken her son against legal agreements tied to her troubled marriage. On paper, the warrant painted her not as a victim, but as a fugitive. To the family, this was a devastating twist. Her mother rejected the idea that Crystal had fled deliberately. "That's not my daughter," she insisted in interviews. "She wouldn't just take off and cut all contact. Something happened to her." To her, the warrant was nothing more than a technicality, a distraction from the darker possibility that foul play had been involved. Theories began to circulate. Some believed Crystal had taken Karam intentionally, perhaps to start a new life away from a failing marriage. Others whispered about the phone call, wondering if it had been a threat, or perhaps a lure. Could someone have manipulated her fears, forcing her to leave the house that night? Investigators did uncover a lead. Reports placed Crystal and her son in Broward County after the disappearance. But even that glimmer of hope quickly faded. No confirmed sightings followed. The car remained missing. And every time the police tried to follow up, the trail ended in silence. The more time passed, the more the case fractured between two opposing views. The legal system labeled her a wanted woman. But her family, and those who knew her best, saw her as a missing person, possibly a victim of something far more sinister. Her colleagues at work described her as responsible and deeply committed to her duties. Her friends insisted she wasn't impulsive, and her role as a mother made it unthinkable that she would simply disappear without securing some kind of plan for her son's future. "She lived for Karam," one friend said. "Everything she did was for him. If she's gone, something's wrong." The official file remained open, yet stagnant, classified as an endangered missing case. But as the months turned into years, no breakthrough came. No body, no car, no answers. In the end, the investigation left more questions than solutions. Who called Crystal that night? Why did she seem so terrified? And if she had truly chosen to run, why had there been no trace of her since? Theories multiplied, facts remained scarce, and for a family desperate for answers, the weight of uncertainty only grew heavier with each passing day. For a brief moment, there was hope. After Crystal Brown and her son vanished from Port St. Lucie, investigators uncovered reports that placed them in Broward County, roughly an hour south. Someone believed they had seen her. Someone thought they recognized Karam. And for a family desperate for answers, even the faintest sighting was a lifeline. Detectives pursued the lead. Broward County, with its dense neighborhoods, sprawling highways, and endless flow of traffic, was both promising and daunting. If Crystal had driven there, she could have blended into the crowd. The silver Toyota Camry, just another vehicle among thousands. Perhaps she had sought refuge with a friend, Or maybe she was running from a threat too dangerous to name. But the trail stopped as quickly as it began. No security footage confirmed her presence. No transactions tied to her name surfaced. The Camry never appeared in parking lots, never turned up on license plate scanners. The supposed sightings became less certain under scrutiny, slipping away like smoke. For investigators, Broward County became the point where possibility collapsed into silence. If Crystal had truly reached the area, she had vanished within its sprawl. If she had never made it there, then the lead itself was nothing more than a false hope. Either way, no one could say for sure. Her mother clung to the idea that Crystal had been in Broward. If she was there once, she told reporters, maybe she's still there. Maybe someone has seen her and just doesn't realize it yet. But the lack of evidence made each day harder to bear. Without proof, the line between hope and despair grew unbearably thin. For the public, Broward County became the backdrop of speculation. Some imagined Crystal hiding out, too afraid to return home. Others suggested something darker had happened there, that her car, her life, her very existence had been swallowed by the county's shadows. Theories ranged from abduction to voluntary flight, but none could be proven. What was undeniable, though, was the silence that followed. After Broward, there were no more leads. The Camry, once described as the most crucial clue, had become a ghost on Florida's roads. Karam, a child who should have been starting school, remained missing. And Crystal, the devoted mother and social worker, was reduced to a face on a flyer, her story passed around in whispers but never solved. The Broward lead was the last thread investigators could tug on. When it snapped, the case unraveled into uncertainty. For Crystal's family, it was torture. Because if Broward was the last place she had been seen, then somewhere in that vast county, among its highways, canals, and neighborhoods, lay the key to a mystery that had gone cold. But no one ever found it. For Crystal's mother, time froze the moment the Camry disappeared into the night. Each day that followed was not measured by clocks or calendars, but by absence, by the silence of a phone that never rang, by the emptiness of a room that should have been filled with a child's laughter. She still lives in the same house where her daughter walked out that night. The same phone number rings on the landline, one she refuses to change. In case Crystal calls, she explained softly, as if her daughter might one day dial those familiar digits. The hope lingers, fragile but alive. Every corner of the house holds a memory. Karam's toys remain in a box by the living room couch. Crystal's favorite mug still sits in the cabinet. Photographs line the hallway, her daughter in a graduation gown, holding her newborn son, smiling at family gatherings. For her mother, they are both comfort and torment. Comfort because they keep her close. Torment because they remind her of everything that was stolen. The nights are the hardest. She often sits by the window where she last watched the Camry vanish, staring at the same street, listening for a sound that will never come. Neighbors say she leaves the porch light on, a beacon in case Crystal or Karam somehow find their way home. The years have stretched cruelly. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone passes with an empty chair at the table. Karam would be a teenager now, but his grandmother still remembers him as the small boy who clung to his mother's hand. Crystal herself would be in her mid-40s, but her mother still pictures her as the woman who promised, "I'll explain later," before driving into the dark. Hope and grief wrestle inside her constantly. Some days she believes her daughter is alive, waiting somewhere, trapped but fighting to return. Other days, the silence feels too heavy, and the possibility of loss presses down like a weight she cannot carry. Yet she refuses to give up. "She's my child," she tells anyone who asks. A mother doesn't stop looking. For those outside the family, the case may just be another unsolved file, one name among many in Florida's long list of missing persons. But for Crystal's mother, it is life itself. Every knock at the door makes her heart skip. Every unfamiliar number that flashes on the caller ID makes her hands tremble. Each moment carries the unbearable question, what if this is the one? What if this is the call that finally brings her back? Her pain is not just personal, it is a haunting reminder of the human cost behind missing persons cases. Behind every flyer, every headline, is a family frozen in grief, living in a world where closure never comes. For Crystal's mother, The anguish is constant, but so is the love. And it is that love, unyielding, unbreakable, that keeps her waiting still. In the years since Crystal Brown and her son vanished, the case has generated more questions than answers. Each possibility opens a door, but behind every door lies only speculation. The truth remains locked away, somewhere in the shadows of that September night. One theory has always lingered at the forefront, that Crystal left intentionally. Supporters of this idea point to her marital struggles, her sudden move back into her mother's home, and the custody issues surrounding her son. The warrant for interference with custody, issued 2 months later, seemed to reinforce the idea. Perhaps, some argue, Crystal simply decided she had had enough and chose to disappear with Karam, starting over in another place, under another name. But that theory has never sat comfortably with those who knew her. Crystal was a planner, a provider. She didn't act on impulse, especially when it came to her son. Running away would have meant cutting ties with everyone she loved, abandoning her career, her community, her family, and above all, her mother. For a woman who spoke to her family daily, the silence was deafening. The second, and far darker possibility is that foul play was involved. The phone call that night remains the most haunting piece of the puzzle. Her mother described her daughter's reaction as one of fear, distress so visible it seemed to consume her. If Crystal was threatened, coerced, or lured, then her departure was not voluntary. Someone else may have dictated that drive into the night. If that's true, the question becomes, who? Was it someone tied to her failing marriage? Someone she knew through her work as a social worker? Or perhaps a figure from her past who resurfaced unexpectedly? The lack of answers fuels endless speculation. Even the lead in Broward County raises troubling possibilities. If she was seen there, did she go willingly, or was she taken? If her car made it that far, where did it vanish afterward? Florida is a state crisscrossed by highways, swamps, canals, and coastlines. A vehicle could disappear quickly, leaving little trace. There's also the unsettling reality that both Crystal and Karam vanished together. Children are rarely invisible in disappearances. Sooner or later, a school, a doctor's office, or even a grocery store encounter sparks recognition. Yet no confirmed sightings of Karam have surfaced in the years since. For many, that silence strengthens the belief that something terrible happened. Theories swirl, but facts remain painfully few. Some cling to the idea of a voluntary disappearance because it keeps hope alive. Others accept the likelihood of foul play, but struggle with the absence of closure. The unanswered questions form a haunting refrain. Who called her that night? Why did she look so terrified? Where did the Camry go? And what became of the little boy who held his mother's hand as they drove away? Every possible answer carries its own weight of tragedy, and until the truth is uncovered, the case of Crystal Brown and her son will remain suspended between two realities, one where she chose to run and one where she never had a choice at all. Today, years have passed since that September night in 2017, yet the streets of Port St. Lucie still hold the silence of unanswered questions. A silver Toyota Camry remains missing. A mother's phone still sits disconnected. And somewhere, in memory if not in body, the faces of Crystal Brown and her son Karam linger like shadows no one can erase. Her disappearance is not just a story of mystery, it is a story of absence. An absence at birthdays, at Christmas dinners, at first days of school. An absence that has hollowed out a family and left a mother waiting by a window for a daughter who never came home. Florida has seen its share of missing person cases, but few feel as haunting as this one, because this was not a stranger or a drifter. Crystal Brown was a mother, a professional, a woman deeply rooted in her community. She had a life worth living and a son worth protecting. To vanish without a trace in the span of one midnight phone call is the kind of riddle that gnaws at the edges of reason. Somewhere, someone knows what happened. Perhaps the person who made that call. Perhaps a witness who noticed something but did not recognize its importance at the time. The truth exists. It simply has not yet been brought into the light. Until then, the story of Crystal and Karam is more than an unsolved case. It is a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly the familiar can become foreign. It is a warning written in silence, urging us to pay attention, to remember, and to never forget those who disappeared into the dark. For Crystal's mother, the waiting continues. For the rest of us, the responsibility is clear, to keep their names alive, to keep their story from fading. Because when silence falls too heavily, memories vanish with it. If you believe their story deserves to be remembered, help keep their trace alive. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Silent Traces. Together, we can make sure the voices of the missing are never lost in the dark.